All right, good afternoon. Welcome to Department of Transportation Roundtable, where our panelists will discuss balancing competing technologies, road infrastructure, and constituent needs. And now I'd like to introduce Kristin White, who I was going to say Chief Counsel of Federal Highway, and I have this really long bio. And then at the end, this title and bio are now outdated as Kristin White has just been named Deputy Director of the Federal Highway Administration. Kristin.
Good afternoon. Okay, I'm going to try that one more time. Yolanda was the loudest and she's in the front. Okay, we talked about being loud in the back, folks. This is going to be a really fun conversation, so let's get some energy. We just heard my boss, the administrator, Shaylin Bada, Federal Highways, really invigorate us, so let's try this one more time. Good afternoon. Okay, excellent. Now we're ready for a state-to-state conversation. Okay, I want to thank Henry, I want to thank Debbie, Calvin, and the amazing CCAT team. I want to thank all of you for continuing to be engaged and present, because that's how we do this hard work of R&D, is continuing to be in the space and learning more and listening. And I want to thank a colleague who had to leave early. Gina Boss is a friend of mine. She and I are both from the other, more important M state called Minnesota. And Gina is now a partner with Henry Liu and the University of Michigan with the CCAT Symposium Collaborative Series. And she had this idea, you know, we hear a lot about maybe the Michigan ecosystem in these CCAT symposia, but what are other states doing? And how are other states collaborating with their research programs to scale innovation in this space? And as someone who came from the Minnesota program, I am super excited to introduce my colleagues here in just a moment to talk about how states and their own ecosystems from the East Coast to the Midwest are really thinking about this. And I think one of the things we forget is that none of us ever had the answer the first time the question was asked. So when I started in this work about 10, 15 years ago, I was calling my colleague Nanette on the end in Maryland, and we were trading ideas back and forth. We were asking, okay, what are your researchers at the University of Maryland doing that maybe my researchers aren't, and how can they build off it? I was calling my friend Elise to be like, oh my gosh, did they literally just say that out loud in this nationwide Zoom call? How do we help people understand how the states really do work and collaborate? And then there's this new generation with Nathan leading Indiana. And so I want to take a moment, introduce each of them and their states, and then they're going to share a little bit about their own work and a little bit of an overview, and then we're going to dive deeper into a conversation. Then I want you to write down your questions. We're going to save about 15, 20 minutes. I actually want an engaged question and answer, because that's what we're here for. We're not just here to listen to me wax on with a microphone. Yuck. We are here to listen and have engaged conversation. So with that, before we start and we introduce these amazing experts, I just want to see by a show of hands, who here is right now directly working in research, Michigan or elsewhere? Excellent. Who here is working in the private sector, technology, innovation for any companies? Okay, and who else is maybe working in government at any level? Okay, so we've got a good mix. So this is the type of ecosystem we're going to be talking about today. So that is the ecosystem that my first colleague to my left and your first left, yeah, because we're really good at directions here. That's why I'm a lawyer. So Elise Feldpausch is the Connected Vehicle Specialist at Michigan DOT. She is really renowned throughout the country with her work in ITS America and others, helping to lead the MASTO, which is the Mid-America State Coalition of over 10 states working on their 10-year strategic plan. Please welcome and clap for Ms. Elise Feldpausch. I think we can do better at claps. All right, Nathan, are you ready? Okay. Nathan is the Emerging Mobility Director at the Indiana Department of Transportation, leading their new program. Nathan. Okay. I heard a woot. We can do one better because we can finish out. Nanette, y'all, is an institution in this field who has helped all of us learn how to be better leaders. Nanette is head of the Connected and Automated Vehicle as the Program Manager in the Office of Policy and Innovation at the Maryland Department of Transportation. Please welcome Nanette. Oh, yes, there we go. All right, so we've got a few prepared questions for you as colleagues, and I want to start with those, and then we're going to stump the panel. So I want to start with Elise. You know, we are here in Michigan. Michigan is known as a leader in this ecosystem, and we are here at CCAT at the university with some researchers that are really steeped in their existing research and in young researchers trying to figure out where they want to go. Would you share a little bit about how Michigan DOT works with the local research innovation ecosystem? What are some of the top research areas that you're working on, and how we can help inspire these researchers to work more collaboratively with state DOTs, MPOs, and other public agencies?
That is a loaded question, Kristin. 3-part question. So we'll start at the beginning. So in Michigan, for those of you, that are kind of new to how Michigan does things, we actually do a research kind of call for ideas. And essentially, on an annualized basis, we put out this request and say, please bring to us your ideas, industry, research institutions, bring to us what you want. Also within the department, you can also, supply an idea, but we fully recognize that our areas lie in completely different areas of expertise. So we really rely on the research community, and the industry can also, submit ideas. Now, this does not say that, hey, I am with U of M, this is my idea, this only needs to go to U of M. It's a completely open forum for ideas and different research topics that we can go into. And I'll tell you, it was very overwhelming the first time that, I was a part of this conversation a decade ago, just to see the vast array of ideas and concepts that could come in, and knowing that, where we would be able to put our expertise and put our spin on it and how we would do it. So the way that it goes is you take those ideas, then we digest them, we pick out our ideas that we think have a lot of legs to them, and then we will put down our interpretation of that idea. Then we will represent it back to the industry through a open kind of conversation. And in that conversation, it allows us to further develop and refine the idea, which will ultimately then go out for kind of an RFP type of a research. So it's very collaborative in the ideation process. And I think it really lends itself towards a very developed concept before it even gets out the door and starts moving forward. So we have a lot of really, our process is really good. We have a very engaged group within our research department at MDOT. And that's the other thing, too, that's a little bit different with MDOT compared to some of the other states, is we have a specific research branch within the department that we will ultimately kind of filter all of these things through, and then we'll, as the experts, PM those or act on the advisory committee. But everything really stems through that research arm. Right now, I think that your second part of your question was about, the areas that we really see being like the upcoming research ideas. So I will say, we're seeing more and more research ideas that stem from different sectors than what we're used to seeing. So typically, right, we think CAV or ITS, and all of those are the research groups that kind of live in that space, bring us our ideas. But now, as this becomes much more aware and prevalent, we start seeing this more in the news and at a national level, we're seeing ideas come from all different walks of transportation that all are very relevant to this. So it's, one of the big research ideas that are really trying to filter down through is how do these new national initiatives really apply themselves to Michigan? And so one of the big ones that's kind of coming up is we're really looking at the idea of how is our state ready for all of this? How can we put ourselves at a point where we're able to really absorb and change and shift the ways in which we think about things to be able to be reactive to the innovations that are coming forward? And there was a third part to your question, Kristin. Will you remind me what your third part was?
Well, we stumped you. First stump of the day. No, I'm kidding. Just maybe any tips on how folks can engage? Because we're going to ask Nathan on the difference between what you talked about in research theoretically versus applied research. Any tips for how folks can engage state DOTs like yourselves?
Yeah, I would say to really go out and look for these open portals and platforms. I do think, I had mentioned that there's kind of a call for contributions or ideas. I think that you actually can submit those at any time through the MDOT research arm and talk to them. Now, we may only address them on an annualized basis, but we collect those ideas and we're able to develop them over that annualized process. So I would encourage you to reach out to your state DOTs, but also to your local municipalities, because there's excellent research that's occurring at all levels of the department. It is not just at a federal level, it's not just at a state level, it's at all levels. And would very much encourage you to go out and look for those opportunities, because I know we're not alone in the way that we do this business.
Nathan, Nanette, anything you want to add before we move on? All right. Okay. So Administrator Bott noted the importance of public-private partnerships. And as we did just that, very informal poll, we know we have researchers here, people from government, people from private sector, and it takes all of us to get that research to action. So Nathan, we were talking about in our conversations the difference between, theoretical research and maybe research that's a little bit more long-term down the pipe versus what the applied research is needed for states to really get on the ground now. And when we talk about states and state DOTs, we're also being inclusive to think about counties, cities, MPOs, and others, including tribal nations. Nathan, how do you approach the distinction between theoretical and applied research? And can you give some examples of what Indiana is working on in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So in Indiana, we've got a similar structure. We have what we call the Joint Transportation Research Program, which was started actually in the late 30s as a collaboration between Indiana, or the Indiana Department of Transportation. It was the Highway Commission at the time, and Purdue University. It has grown. It now, at last look, I think we've got regional partners from Notre Dame to UIUC, Cincinnati, folks all across the region. So just a plug that, similar to your call for projects, we accept research in a very similar fashion. The JTRP, the Joint Transportation Research Program, is actually embedded in the Department of Transportation. So we've got a mix of, the executive director is a Purdue faculty member, and then we've got a mix of faculty members as well as executive staff that sit on the kind of the board of directors of the transportation program, which really allows us to collaborate continuously. And to the applied research aspect, the JTRP, we've got some great slides that, or visual aids, I suppose, that talk about impact. We believe impact is at the intersection of and collaboration between research institutions, government, and industry. It's all three partners, working together to get to that applied research aspect. It's a three-legged stool that really cannot stand without all three partners. And I think as we heard yesterday, GM talked about their initial foray into V2X. It was not C-V2X at the time, but V2X, and they had some CTSs on the road talking to nobody. And then the DOTs responded to the SPAT challenge, and we put a handful of signals out there that were then talking to maybe a handful of CTSs. And then another aspect of government came in and really pulled that leg out and pulled momentum back with the FCC ruling, and so we saw a sharp decline there because all three partners were not working together in that space. We believe in that wholeheartedly. A good example of what we're doing currently, particularly in the CAV space, we are collaborating between Purdue University, ourselves, and DriveWise. If you're not familiar with DriveWise, they're a vendor that provides alerts in cab to commercial vehicles through the ELD, the electronic logging devices. And the alerts are for congestion and then emergency or immediate slowdown alerts to really provide that heads up display to the drivers within those vehicles. Ohio was actually one of the first to deploy it, and we evaluated using Purdue, using trajectory data, the effectiveness of this, and we were super excited because what we saw was that 25% of the trucks slowed down by 5 miles an hour after receiving that alert. And what we're doing is we're using that slowdown as a proxy for alert, for eyes up, attention to the roadway. You could say maybe it's 3, 4, 5. You can pick your number. We used that 5 mile an hour cutoff. So what we're going to do is we're partnering with, and we actually just signed a contract. We now have DriveWise in Indiana. It's something that the DOT pays for as a subscription and is free to the drivers. So you get that adoption, which is really important. And we're going to work directly with DriveWise over the next year through a research project to better refine the alert distance and the alert frequency to make sure that we're not overstimulating drivers so that they turn it off. Congestion alerts are one of those that I'm a little bit skeptical on. If we're providing congestion alerts in a city, you're going to tune it out. What we really want to do is provide that alert in spaces where you're not expecting it, and we want eyes on the road. So we're going to work with them to further define that, and then that will be something that DriveWise uses and then can continue to push out for other DOTs to use, and really is a benefit all the way across the spectrum.
Great example, thank you. And a couple things I heard that I just want to pull out from Nathan's comments is this idea that the research really needs to be outcomes-based, right? That was emergency response, right? Reducing congestion. And the second thing he shared, I don't know if you caught it, is that the other states are talking to each other, right? It's not that Indiana is trying to do research that both Maryland and Michigan and others are doing. They're trying to build off each other's research. And I think that's really important for this research ecosystem to understand. And that's especially important, and that's how you come to be as successful as Ms. Nanette and Maryland. Nanette, Maryland is just inimitable when it comes to applying for and getting discretionary grants. And as we know, and as Administrator Botten, we've talked about this year, there are 47 discretionary grant programs. There is $550 billion going out there. A large portion of that can fund connected and automated technologies. And so you've been really successful in applying for what we call notices of funding opportunity, known as NOFOs, where they announce the funding. You've been really pursuing some of these technology grants. You've been doing some great work on rural automation. Nanette, can you talk a little bit about how a state DOT, including successfully Maryland, approaches these NOFOs, how you create that ecosystem partnership across the sectors Nathan mentioned to create the grant, get the feedback you need, and be successful in your award selection?
I can certainly talk about that. And just a comment before I do, I already have 2 ideas I'm going to steal and take home. So
That's how it works?
Yeah, the research portal, and then the evaluation of DriveWise, which we use at the Port of Baltimore. So definitely worthwhile to be a part of this, and collaboration is huge. So, but to your question, I first want to recognize our team that we have that looks at the grants, and they are amazing. They've got their finger on the pulse of what's coming out, what's out now. Of course, celebrating the successes, looking at all the research or the resources and the tools that are available to help put those grant proposals together. And part of that information goes out to our CAV working group. And our Maryland CAV working group is over 700 stakeholders, so it's really great to get that information out to them, and then they in turn share it with their folks. And like Kristin mentioned, most every grant has some sort of potential for a CAV aspect. So we use them as a resource and a way to generate interest and energy. Also, you asked particular about the, or mentioned, the RAV grant and the research rural autonomous vehicle research grant that just, the NOFO came out in the spring, and I believe it was like the 1st of March. Maryland did have a proposal that we submitted. I'm not going to talk about that. Jury's still out, right? So, but I was excited about the structure of that grant and the way that it's set up to have the universities be a part of, or the lead, right, on that proposal. It allows for flexibility that the government agencies may not have. And so that's important. And then also the fact that it must introduce a demonstration project. So it's got to have that practical application. And the collaborative effort that was put together by one of our universities to dig in on this included 5 universities, some in-state, some not, 4 private companies, and then MDOT, the CAV team, played an advisory role. So it was a great exercise in and of itself. And over those maybe 8 to 10 weeks, starting with networking at the TRB in January in DC, there was some conversation going on like 2 or 3 times a week with this team. And it really helped for the researchers to hear more from the private entities about just how would that work, and can you work together? Can there be interoperability? Can there be a sharing of data? So all of those, deeper dive discussions were really effective, and they're going to continue on with that team, with or without the grant. There's plans for them to work together to learn more, to have some site visits in Maryland and maybe some workshops, and be prepared for the next thing that comes along. So.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I heard a couple things. One is go to TRB, you might get a grant, but all jokes aside, we know that the Transportation Research Board annual meeting in January is a great way to connect with your 13,000 closest friends and maybe even a few folks who might win a grant with you. But 2, Nanette, you also said something that I think is really important, is that you're also building then ongoing relationships. Even if we aren't successful in that particular grant or in that particular project, you're building deep connections across these industries. And as we know, that's how we actually are successful as a coalition, as an industry. But a lot of times we talk about success, and I'm going to transition. It's at the end of a couple-day event. We've been talking about a lot of good things. We don't always talk about failures, the big F word, yes. And it is really hard in the public realm to talk about failure because we have presidents who I report to, or governors, or county commissioners, or mayors, and they don't always love to hear about failure. But we can talk about lessons learned. So I want to just pivot. Elise and I have had this conversation when we both worked in the Midwest together about failure, how we talk about it. Elise, I would love your perspective on either MASTO, your national work, or even just the Michigan DOT perspective on how you talk about failure so that we can learn from it. Instead of fail fast and break things, we fail forward together.
Well, there's so many failures to choose from, as was pointed out by my esteemed panelist over here. I jest.
It's how we learn together. It's how we learn.
No, and I think, rather than focusing on any particular individual time of failure, I will talk about the idea that failure really is an opportunity. It's not something that I think should be looked at with fear. It's something that, as we live in this space, we know it is a risky space. And any of the excellent DET directorship, leadership levels will tell you that failure is fine. Failure is fine. Failure is how you learn. And I will say one of the big things, I'm particularly focused on research here. It is fine for research to find that the information is not as relevant as you originally thought, right? We know that as we go into research, it's not always going to be a positive outcome. And I would say that it's really important to reflect on that. And I was actually talking with a colleague from Minnesota, not Kristin, but another colleague from Minnesota actually about a month ago. And we were talking about this idea of how do you reflect on the projects, whether it's a success or a negative, and figure out how to move forward. And it was something as simple as like a 1 or 2 page document summarizing what the idea was, what the active findings were, and then what the recommendation was moving forward, and really being reflective on what that recommendation was, and not being afraid for that recommendation to be like, it was a great learning opportunity, and that's all it was, right? Because a lot of the times we want to say, well, this idea was so great, now we're going to put it everywhere, and that's not always applicable, because sometimes even successful research projects are things that are great where they are, but they don't have statewide applicability. And so I would say really looking at failure as this opportunity to learn both positives and negatives, right? Like sometimes your learnings and your findings are that's not as applicable as I thought. And that's really the way I think that you should approach this idea of failure, is it has such a negative connotation, right? No one wants to fail. I don't want to fail. I've certainly failed my own fair share of times, and it's never easy, right? You think you've got this really great concept, really great idea, and then you find out that's really not all that applicable as I would have liked it to be, but yet you still learn, and you're able to use those as jumping off points, and it really stems down into any opportunity. I mean, Michigan, I think, if we look at like CAV exclusively, and we look at I think we're not alone, right, in the idea of the DSRC deployments that have occurred, right? You can look at 5 to 10 years ago, the mass amount of DSRC devices that were deployed out in the field. You could say that was a failure. You invested in 1,000 DSRCs that are now essentially bricks on the roadway. How is this a success? And it's like, well, it's a learning opportunity, because not only are we able to address the fact that technology and innovation is a critical component for our success in Michigan, we're also able to say that in spite of that challenge, now we have learned X, Y, Z. We've invested in a strategic delivery plan that takes those investments, takes those learnings, and then moves it forward. So it's really about how you kind of rephrase the idea of a failure and look at it as an opportunity to be able to address those ideas and help other states and be able to learn from them.
I love that. Okay, you heard it from us. Failure is okay. And what I also heard from Elise is it helps us create and reframe these limiting beliefs that, sometimes in research we have to in order to move forward. And it takes a lot of humility. These folks, these are leaders that are humble leaders that will acknowledge these facts. But I actually want to pivot, Nanette, and I want to hear some bragging from the Maryland ecosystem. Maryland really has this really cool ecosystem. You shared a little bit of a snippet of it. Is it a unique region? Is it a unique ecosystem you've created to allow you all to research in this space? Or could you describe a little bit more about, you've talked about the working group, the state, your partners. What makes your region so unique to allow us to continue to scale these technologies?
We're the best M state.
Oh, you heard it. Throw down.
So there's at least 2 different MDOTs here, and we're the third, right? So, but yeah, Maryland, seriously, we've done a lot in the area of collaboration, and I have to say that's our strong suit in the CAV echo space, and the entities that are a part of those conversations, definitely academia. And, you know, we've got Johns Hopkins, we've got University of Maryland, you know, so we've got some great institutions in Maryland that are doing a lot of good things, you know, in the autonomy, you know, research and practical research as well. You know, part of Hopkins is the applied physics lab, and so, you know, that piece of it. So yes, we've got some good players there. We've got some private entities that are a part of what we're doing and a part of our discussions. 13, I believe, out of the 35 or so companies that have expressed an interest to play in Maryland Sandbox, right? They've expressed an interest in research and testing and deployment in CAV in Maryland. 13 of those are Maryland companies. And so we've got some big, we've got some small that you may have heard of. Forterra that just rebranded. They used to be Robotic Research, RRAI, been in the Department of Defense world and for 20 plus years. And then there's another one I like to brag about, SteerTech, which is a small women-owned business that does the parking technology, but they have taken that and deployed it to trucks as well. So, you know, focusing on the yard space, yard work for industry. But we've got military installations, you know, that are in Maryland as well that are partners. So especially Aberdeen Proving Ground is one of the ATEC sites, I think 4 or 5 only in the U.S., the testing and evaluation centers. And they've got some pretty cool stuff going on up there that testing going on, and also the, again, Army, but Army Research Lab Collaboration Center. So they're a part of our discussions. And just, you know, I think that's a good piece of you know, the, and local governments. I do want to mention local governments too. I know not every state brings local governments to the table, and we have really pushed hard to include them, to provide information, not only executive level information so that they can help their, you know, executive staff to understand what CAV is and why it might be important, but also even roadmaps with different activities that they might want to think about for near term and long term. And that was through our MPO, so Baltimore Metropolitan Council. They've helped with a lot of that work. So good stuff going on. Thank you.
Thank you. And I love that last note, Nanette, to really focus on local. Innovation is not just global, it's local. And whether it's local townships, small cities, large cities, counties, tribes, there's a lot of that innovation in that local area as well that these states and these regions can support. I want to transition to you, Nathan. We've talked kind of at a high level about a couple of topics, but let's talk about kind of the 2 words of the moment, digital infrastructure. And I feel like I want to be at a baseball game where it's like infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. We keep hearing about this phrase. And for those that are maybe newer to the conversation or newer in the research space, this is this idea that, you know, for the last 60 years, we've been building, you know, paved and concrete roads and bridges. But as we all know, this innovation ecosystem, the future mobility requires data sharing capabilities. It requires fiber optic in the roadway. It requires sensors, TMCs to share data. It requires AI, quantum maybe even in the future. Nathan, I'd love your opinion on how you in Indiana or your team is thinking about digital infrastructure, you know, how you're thinking about data sharing, which is not a new topic by any means for the last 20, 30 years in this region, but maybe newer to this national lexicon of digital infrastructure. Just tell us a little bit about how you're using data and what that means to you.
Sure, absolutely. I want to start by talking a little bit about how we're using connected vehicle data and data in that space to improve our infrastructure. So a little bit of a riff on digital infrastructure, but I am absolutely excited for, when we talk about applied research, what we can do in the very, very near term when it comes to the amount of data that's now out there with sensors on vehicles, right? There's just Administrator Bott mentioned that just a minute ago, that there is just an overload of data, right, in that space. And I would say in the last 6 months, we've talked to essentially every large OEM and or third-party vendor that represents the OEM, which is fantastic, especially in light of Wejo's insolvency, that there is now redundancy, that sector, that market is healthy and is growing, and folks are leaning into that space. But it's the idea of how do we use that information to operationalize the data for improvements in the way we do business currently. And so I've got 6 research projects that are going to kick off in July that are going to look at things from asset management, pavement condition using tire pressure sensoring monitoring systems, to friction using advanced trajectory data to look at safety. We are absolutely focused on safety in Indiana. We've got a commitment to reducing fatalities on our roadways by 25% over the next 10 years. And the real excitement in that space is the scalability. So we talk about not just at the DOT level, but our smaller, our rural communities, our communities that frankly don't have the funding, the resources to be able to have a robust asset management plan or to be able to do the safety analytics necessary. With connected vehicle data, we can do that. We can scale that with our resources, and we can provide that out to our local technical assistance programs. So we are planning to scale and push because frankly, last year on Indiana roadways, 2/3 of the fatalities were on non-state controlled roadways. So we have not just, we have a responsibility to assist all of the local communities in that space. When it comes to digital infrastructure, what we're trying to do more in the traditional sense is create, not a digital twin, but we're taking the feeds that we're providing to our standard ITS infrastructure, to our DMS boards, our travel time signs, truck parking, all of that information, and we're working through a couple of current research projects to take the JSON feeds and then to push that out using geofencing. And so to eventually, once vehicles can communicate, have that V2I connectivity, we can provide all the information that we provide on our physical infrastructure directly into the vehicle. So if you miss that DMS board, you didn't miss the information. We can continue to provide that information to, based on trajectory and that additional information. So we're leaning into digital infrastructure in that space. We want to provide that information out.
As does the US DOT. So the Federal Highway Administration, everyone is really investing heavily in this concept. We have some concept of operations, some strategies that will be forthcoming in this year, later this year. And it's because we understand this is such an important need. So we are getting to the buzzer before audience Q&A. We have about time for 2 more direct questions to our colleagues on the panel. So this is my reminder to you. Think about what you want to ask or stump these folks. This is our time to really figure out how we can support this public-private research ecosystem. Okay, so 2 more questions, then it's question and answer time. I would love to go to Elise. Elise, we talk a lot about funding. We've already heard about discretionary grant opportunities. There's $500 billion in discretionary grants, but we forget that state DOTs are direct recipients of the Highway Trust Fund, and each year receive billions in direct funding and what we call formula funding. It's a formula percentage of the Highway Trust Fund that's directly allocated to state DOTs like Michigan, Indiana, and Maryland. And there's certain programs that they get to use that for, like program and research, planning, highway safety. And it's kind of this untold story that a lot of states like you 3 are using that formula funding to invest in connected and automated vehicle research development and, most importantly, deployment. Would you talk a little bit about how Michigan is using their formula program and what kind of funding streams, if you want to call it that, what types of programs you're using to invest in ITS and these technologies?
For sure. So I think it's one of those things that, again, I'm beating this drum, but it's the idea that we're no longer insular to ourselves, right? Like we used to just be, we were ITS CAV, we were kind of this like little independent scrappy group, and we just kind of existed on our own, and that went on for a decade. I'm just speaking specifically for Michigan, right? I don't know about you guys if you're scrappy or not, but we were scrappy back in the day, and now it's so much more transparent. Everyone knows about the opportunities of robotics and AI and ITS and digital infrastructure and digital twinning and all these great things and buzzwords as they continue to kind of infiltrate throughout the whole of all of transportation department. We start seeing these opportunities to really look at creative ways that we can insert this technology into the more traditional projects. And so while we do utilize, the grant opportunities that exist and we'll continue to pursue those, we've really tried to look at the different ways we can get ourselves and our little technology pieces into these large road projects, whether they're mega projects that are doing 100 miles on the roadway reconstruction, or even if it's just like a signal modernization project. We're really looking at the ways in which we can utilize those projects that are already existing, have already been approved, and add a little extra funding to put technology in there, because in the grand scheme of things, a little money for technology can go a very, very long way in being able to make a big difference in the ways in which we're able to help save lives and move forward. And I know we're running it short, so I'm going to cut my response at that. But I do think it is really important. Actually, I was going to say I cut myself off, but I've got one more piece that I want to say, and it's not about the formula funding, but it's about the criticality of looking at alternative business models for technology deployment. There's a really wonderful research project, actually, that is happening in one of our counties here in Michigan that's looking at alternative business models for the deployment and O&M of CAV technology. And I think it's a really critical opportunity to be able to look at the different ways that you are able to deploy and then continue to move this technology forward at a rate that we may not be able to do the way that we go about doing business as like a government, a public government entity. So I think the criticality of looking at the varied ways in which you can deploy things will really make the entire space much more diversified and much more resilient.
Okay, so be scrappy. That's another action item. I love it. But it also, I heard, Elise, you say that it's also looking internal, because our state departments of transportation across the country are very large. They are thousands of people wide with many different offices and divisions. And sometimes one hand, the left hand, we like to say, doesn't always know what the right hand is doing. And so these are the people that are helping to make those connections, but you all can help them as well, right? Researchers know what the different research need statements are. The private sector, I'm sure, is meeting with different people within the state DOTs. Help these folks make those connections. And that making connections is something, actually, Nanette, I'd love to talk to you about. Nanette, you've been really involved in a lot of these national coalitions. We just talked about looking inwards to the state DOT, but it's also important you all have become so successful because you're looking outwards as to what's going on in this large regional and national ecosystem. Nanette, you've been really involved in ITS America, in the region. There's even this Eastern Transportation Coalition, which is the states along Interstate 95 on the East Coast. Would you share a little bit about your involvement in those institutions and associations and how that has helped you, Maryland, and even maybe this panel, how it's helped you really connect all of the work in Maryland to the outside world and vice versa?
Happy to, yes. And so one of the things that we realized early on in talking about CAV internal to MDOT is, our team is small, or small but mighty, right? And so how do we leverage that? And there are a ton of conversations that are going on in these different groups, some that were already mentioned, a couple others, partnership for automated vehicle education, PAVE, AMVA, I'm not sure if anybody's heard of them, but the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, and they have an AV group that I have gotten to chair the last 2 years, which is awesome. Even the Uniform Traffic Control Device, conversations, and UL 4600, there's a lot of dialogue that's going on in a lot of different venues. And we need to be a part of that. We need to not only, roll up our sleeves and try to figure out, what can we all agree to as far as basic standards or basic framework, requirements, so be a part of those conversations, but bringing that information back home and trying to figure out, okay, with what we are learning, what can we do with that? And so how does it meet with the goals that we have in Maryland and what we want to prioritize? So that's a big piece of it as well. And if nothing more, you start to know who the players are so that when you do have questions, you know who the go-to people are, and that's super important. So something that, we've definitely utilized that. In fact, so much so that we have a spreadsheet for our team. So everybody has, assignments for these, to cover these different groups. And when we meet monthly, we, share what it is that is being discussed in those groups. So it's really important.
I love that knowledge transfer idea. Thank you, Nanette. And I do see even a couple of these National Association leaders here in the room. So I see Yolanka Wolf with the Community Air Mobility Initiative. That's another, great association I know folks are a part of. I see John Quant with 5GAA. These are examples of institutions that we should all be participating in. And then to Nanette's point, bringing that information into your agency, institution, research team, so they also know what's going on. Okay. Now here comes for the conversation. Everyone, I'm sure, has a list of questions they want to ask. Debbie is ready with the microphone. And so, you know what, Nathan, lead us into the Q&A. I want to do maybe 1 minute or less. What is one of the most frequently asked questions you get as Debbie starts to look at hands that are raised? I don't know who was first. I think this lovely individual in the back was first. What is one of the top FAQs you get?
I think probably the most frequent thing asked from whether it's leadership to the public is when. When is it going to be available? When can I use it? And what does that mean?
And you have an answer for us, right?
Yes. Someday.
Someday. I like it. All right. Where was the first microphone? Oh, right there. Oh, excellent. Welcome. Hi.
Me? Okay. Thank you for the panel. It's nice to see the Federal Highway and the DOTs on the same panel. I've been looking forward to this day. So my question is kind of targeted towards you, Kristin, and kind of spills over all of you. And I was meaning to ask this question to Shailen, but Jim didn't take any audience question. So I am going to ask it to you. By the way, I'm Rini Shironi, I work for Toyota, car company, and I do research to develop next generation of crash avoidance system. And I have a lot of complaint against all of you. So let's start with that first. So why is US has such a hodgepodge, lack of standard road design? We cannot find any clear criteria, even for individual states, forget about any federal highway guideline on lane markings, guardrail, concrete divider, roadside objects. So these things are all important for us to know so we can design a system effectively. Lack of lane marking, another big problem. And I try to talk to some local DOTs about it, and if you ask them, they are like, oh, that road is not my problem. Talk to the county. County's like, we're poor, we don't have any money. So we have given up. This is why car companies spend millions of dollars trying to develop new technology to prevent crashes. And I was so excited to Shailen said the 43,000 fatalities. Nobody has mentioned this in this conference before that. That is a huge problem. Our first priority needs to address those gaps to reduce that number. And all these things, little things which seemingly little, like lack of lane marking, lack of standard, lack of information, is contributing to that. Like a lot of this OEM system would be so much more effective if the lane lines were great, but it's not. So that's my first question. Second question is,
Do you mind? Let's start with the first, because I have a terrible memory, all right? Okay, first of all, we hear you and we appreciate that. And I actually, before we talk about our perspectives, because the Federal Highway Administration and the USDO is actively working on this, and I'll give you some examples, I want to do a little audience participation, because Shailen and I have both been impacted by people on the topic of safety. Okay, so get ready to stand or sit. Who in this room, and I'm going to ask you to stand or raise a hand if you are a mobility differential, who has had a loved one, a friend, someone in their life who has lost their life or been impacted in a traffic crash? I am standing for a reason. Absolutely. Jerry, stand. Raise your hands and stand tall. So it's about 50% of us, you all, that is below the national average. I want you to sit down. There's a reason we need to see these people who've been impacted. There's a reason we're doing this work. Nathan, we talked about outcomes. This is why we're doing this. And for a long time, prior to 30, 35 years ago, back, I would like to say before I was born, but that's not true, we were not thinking about the digitization, the digital infrastructure of our system. We were building infrastructure that was hard infrastructure, and all the information we had was on pieces of paper. Our forefathers and foremothers never thought about this digital transformation we're thinking about. But we are now, to your point. And one of the reasons until the last couple years, and this year we're doing a lot of work on it, and I'll mention it, The reason we haven't in the past been thinking a lot about this is because we do have a federal-state system. Each state has a lot of unique abilities in this country. They are their own laboratories of democracy and innovation. You heard 3 just different examples here. And until this last year and a half with Federal Highway Administration and other US DOT leaders, we didn't realize we needed to all come together with federal US DOT leadership to come up with some common, let's say, strategies and plans for whether it's digital infrastructure or vehicle-to-anything technologies. So those are 2 examples. The V2X National Plan is going to be forthcoming in the next, I'd like to say month, but it's probably coming early summer, 2024. And it took us to come together to hear you and say, we need a plan to have us all work together. Because counties, metropolitan regional organizations, MPOs, RDOs, tribal governments, states, regions, and the federal government need to be working together on this. So I completely hear you. Those are 2 examples. Again, we have a digital infrastructure strategy and a V2X plan that are coming out this year that are going to give us guidance on how we do that together. I would also argue, if it hasn't been talked about, there's 2 amazing initiatives coming out of the US DOT. In June, we are partnering with the White House to announce some initiatives on AI in transportation to develop common data sets in a shared platform. And we also have the AI for Complete Streets initiative. Again, all coming out of this administration, which I'm really proud to shout out. But let's continue the conversation. And as we talked about being humble leaders, hold us accountable so we do the work that we've been talking about. That was a lot of Kristin talking. Any of our audience, you want to respond?
So just to add to that, also wonderful responses, Kristin. I think that we've seen a lot of leadership come out of the US DOT and in the last couple of years when it comes to connective innovations, and it's just really very inspiring to be able to have that. But I will say that, there's also the challenges that arise being I think actually all of us up here, which is surprising, are all northern states, and that can be a real challenge when it comes to infrastructure retention and the need to constantly redo, different things. For instance, specifically, you mentioned pavement markings, and I can only speak for, the DOT roadways, but we redo them every year. And every year the weather and the snowplows take them back off. And so it's this constant fight and the constant allocation of resources and identifying how we can balance the utilization of those resources with what we know that we need. And so by working with the US DOT and being able to see the digital infrastructure strategies and the ways in which we can prioritize this, it helps us to be able to say, well, maybe we need to double that. Maybe we need to change the standards for pavement markings that we utilize in Michigan to be able to be more robust. But until we can have the justification to be able to do so, it can be a real challenge to get those resources allocated.
Yeah, if I can add to that too, it really does become unfortunately, feels like a cop-out, but it's a resource. It's just a resource conversation. So as we're going through part 5 of the METCD, we don't take the METCD, we develop an offshoot, the IMETCD, and we're going through and talking about, as a state, the DOT is adopting 6-inch lines, which is something that is a benefit in that space. As we've got one person on our committee that is the local technical assistance partner that is responsible for the local roads. And I wanted to move into a space where we would require it down the road, and it became a whoa, that is such an investment that the counties and the cities can't afford. Now then maybe there's a conversation about formula funding and how do we get the appropriate funding for the counties and cities, which Indiana is leaning into that, but it still won't fill the gap. We're going to triple our safety budget starting in fiscal 25 to, again, safety is at top of mind for us, and so we're going to lean into that, and a good chunk of that tripling is going to the local communities. But that still will not, that won't put paint or durables for that matter. As we're talking about, snowplows are going to scrape those off every single year. If we had inlaid durables, that would be a solution, but that's an exorbitant cost on county lane mileage that we've got all across this wide space.
So strategies are coming out, but we have more work to do. I saw you wanted to maybe add something to that.
Just a little something. So just 2 thoughts. And one is, I think the striping, all of the infrastructure is extremely important, and it's been said, I'm sure you all know, but what the AVs seem to need for infrastructure is what the humans need as well. So this is not a new problem. It's something that the DOTs have struggled with forever, and we'll continue to just do the best that we can. But I also want to mention, Nathan mentioned the MUTCD, and just we're in an exercise as well, to figure out, how do we take that new Part 5 that deals with just the AVs, and what are we going to do with it in Maryland? We've got a year and a half, I guess, to try to figure that out. So we're having conversations, and it's important to hear from the AV companies. They did that at the national level, and we're doing that at the state level too.
Thank you. And I know you had a second question, but I also saw some other hands, so we'll come back to you once we hear from everyone. Who was next? Oh, we've got Jerry.
And I promised Kristin that I will ask a hard question. Yeah. So Jerry He from Carson UTRC. Since we're talking about connected automated vehicles here, I wanted to ask about the coordination, collaboration, and contention between state and local DOTs. If we are following the news around the country, especially on the West Coast, LA DOT and SFMTA and the state of California government doesn't necessarily work hand in hand together. I think they're because AVs are being deployed on local roads, but the jurisdiction is being given to state governments. So there's a lot of contention on who's supposed to be regulating this. And I think it's similar in Seattle and Washington as well. So could you please share from your experience what was working, what was not working when you are working with the local levels? How does Michigan work together with Detroit? How does Indiana work together with Indianapolis? And what about Maryland and Baltimore, for example? And I would love to have Kristin chime in as well. How do you see the role of the federal government here in this ecosystem of federal, state, and local coordination?
Easy question,
Very
Jerry.
easy.
Thank you. Any takers?
I'll start, I guess, if that's fine. So I think it's one of those things that we see the criticality of a borderless solution, right? And I want to, we were just talking before about like the really wonderful leadership at the federal level that we've seen very, and in the handful of years, it's been really exemplary. But in the before times, right, we were kind of forced into this area that we were none of us comfortable, where we had to move to a borderless conversation. We had to shift towards coalitions, mega region initiatives, and different things because we didn't have that very powerful federal guidance. So we started to have those conversations with ourselves. And we went from a place where you had, this was my road, and your car drives on my road, and then it moves over and it drives on his road, and I don't care how it drives on his road because that's his. And we want to have that competition because we're going to be better. And that whole idea of cooperation, which is kind of where it started. We're like, oh, we're still competing and we don't want them to do well, but whatever, we'd like their information. We've really moved to this, everyone laughs, it's true. Everyone moved to this really collaborative space where we realize that, yeah, there's competition for funding, but all of us are responsible for moving the technology and the industry forward. And unless we're all willing to be supportive of one another and be able to collectively link arms and move forward, it's never going to happen. And so I think that, while we say that it's borderless internal to the state, which is absolutely 1,000% critical, it is just as critical to be borderless when you're talking with your state agencies or your state partners, or even internationally, which is not something that we get into too terribly often, but there are a handful of us at the top and the bottom of the country that do have that, as a topic. So it is something that is really important, but I do see this it's like, it was so important to have the challenges that we had in the past to bring us to where we are now, where we not only have this, the mass federal leadership from FHWA, USDOT, the Secretary's office, but we also have the wonderful partnerships that had to be established to make us deal with the muck that kind of, existed in the past. And it's like it's created this really powerful environment that I don't know if it would exist if we hadn't had to kind of tread the waters that we had in the past. So I don't have an answer per se or a way that, I would say we do it. It just is something that it needs to be a focus, and it's not about, keeping your own siloed and, success to yourself. It's about being able to go and partner off with your state agencies and look at things corridor-wise, transcontinental corridor-wise, or mega regions, or all these different things because we all share a vested interest in being successful.
Cooperation. I love it, everyone. I will just add before we go to the next question, I think is somewhere, we'll have them raise their hand. Okay, over there is, you did ask for a federal perspective. We have partners at the National Highway Traffic Safety and Vehicle Administration, NHTSA, They are very, very much at the table with Federal Highway Administration, all the other transit agencies like FTA, and this is a constant. But as half of our room raised to say that we have been impacted by traffic crashes, if not fatalities, their work is to create a regulatory system that upholds safety, and they take that extraordinarily seriously. That is why right now DOT is in a convening form, right? We want to make sure we are listening. Just yesterday, there was a congressional hearing where the chair of the Automated Vehicle Industry Association was talking about their perspective. We need to hear their perspective. We need to hear the local community's perspective. We need to hear the public's perspective. And I don't know if I see a general member of the public in here, but I think next year we might want to have a public conversation on what they would like to see, as well as the private sector innovators that are in this space as well. We had another question.
Yeah,
Yes, welcome.
Yes, I had a question regarding the digital road infrastructure. So I come originally from Germany, and in Germany, the road authorities are discussing to own the digital road and make them available in a certain quality to the OEMs. And there would be a business model that allows them to invest in that digital road system. But here, what I'm understanding is you have it privatized. I mean, any company could scan and create the digital road and use it. So has that ever been considered that you would work together, the collection of the DOTs, make the standard, own the digital road, and make it then available through a proper business model to the collection of OEMs that want to use that, in particular thinking about connected, automated, and even fully automated driving?
Oh, sure. Come from Germany and show us up. But I heard, Tony, were you trying to add to that question?
I just want to clarify, are you discussing with mostly freeways that are owned, or like even incentives?
Let's start with the freeways first.
Okay. Because curb management then gets a little more complicated.
I want to simplify a little bit, but the freeways.
This is how we have discussion, friends. I like this. Okay, I am happy to share the federal USDT perspective, but I'm sure y'all have some thoughts on this. No? Yes? Nathan? Maybe?
I guess a quick point of clarification. Are you speaking in HD mapping, in high definition digital infrastructure? So that's not something we've explored in depth. What we've talked about, at least theoretically, and there's different ideas on where that lives. I think ultimately our federal partners would be a good spot, like Turner Fairbank. Just plug in that for a second. But having a data hub, standardizing data, providing a repository that has standardized data that states can pull from, instead of, I have a little bit of hesitation when it comes to privatizing what we do. Generally, it seems like DOTs are good at spending money, not taking money. That's why it ultimately, toll roads, we end up offloading that. We've got Section 111 that doesn't even allow us to commercialize, right, on federal land. So there's some things that would need to be changed, I suppose, in that space. But we've talked about having some sort of data hub, data center, database that standardizes and allows OEMs to sell data to a national space, have a landing spot that would allow them to sell it, because it does cost money to analyze, collate, and provide, and then having the states or locals, those folks, being able to pull that data in a standardized manner. Because that's one of the issues that we're dealing with as we talk to the different OEMs, is everybody's got a different definition of whether it's hard braking, whether it's whatever those different definitions are. And so if we can get down to the raw data and pull that out, I think that's, but that doesn't necessarily answer your question when it comes to.
Yes. And I can touch on that too, because I know we are at time, sadly, and I do want to close with a quick 30-minute thank you and last stump you question with these guys. But to your point, the U.S. federal government is looking into that right now. Nathan mentioned Turner Fairbank, which is the Federal Highway Research Institution. They've already been piloting like a GitHub and an open source platform in connected vehicle data, and now we are looking this summer into doing that in a more national model. So let's touch base, and you can tell us how it's done. Colleagues, before we put our hands together and thank these extraordinary thought leaders and thought partners, we have one last question at the end for you. We're going to call this the lightning round. 30 seconds or less, starting with Nanette. What is one topic you'd like to see us talking about at next year's CCAT that progresses this conversation forward? Go.
OEMs to have the V2X integrated into the vehicles. I think there's a lot more that needs to be discussed there, and how to do it and how to encourage it. And it's absolutely necessary. It's something that it's sort of a chicken and the egg, and it's a big part of the conversation.
Thank you, Nanette. Nathan.
All right, I'm impatient, so I'm going to continue to stay with the connected vehicle data because we can do that now. I want to say that by this time next year, all three of us and my DOT peers are utilizing data. We've got standardized applications, and we are improving safety and operations because I'm a traffic engineer by training. That's what drives me. That we are actively improving safety and operations through use of that immense amount of data.
Yes, I think my 30-second thing is that I would hope that we would focus on the criticality of holistic solutioning, of not only, we talk about the chicken and the egg. I'm tired of talking about the chicken and the egg. Like, can't we just have a whole omelet and be able to say, this is my solution? We look at the community as a whole, and we really consider all the aspects. We don't deploy without having that other piece that comes in to be a part of the conversation.
Next year, brunch at CCAT with connected vehicles. Debbie, I hope you wrote it down. Thank you.
Thanks. I just have a couple quick announcements. The student poster competition is about to begin. Please engage with these top-notch students. We award $4,000 in scholarships, so vote for your favorite one. Just scan the QR code in the program, and the instructions are right there for voting. At the same time, we have a special guest presenter in this room, Nick Zanakis from Covington and Burlington LLP. Nick will be discussing smart technologies and frameworks for the future. Nick will start in we'll give him 5 minutes and get a little transition here. Okay, thank you.